America's military edge slips in Venezuela, and no one is talking about what it really means. Let me take you back to March 5th of this year. That's the day the Russian Ministry of Defense quietly announced the deployment of a small but highly symbolic military contingent to Venezuela, officially, a technical mission to support the Maduro regime's aging air defense systems. The Pentagon, in its usual measured tone, called it unhelpful but not unexpected. The State Department issued a boilerplate condemnation. Most major U.S. media outlets ran a single paragraph buried on page A12, if at all. Business as usual, right? Wrong. What happened that day wasn't just another routine provocation in America's backyard. It was the latest and most visible sign that the United States is losing its unchallenged military dominance in Latin America, a region Washington has treated as its exclusive sphere of influence since the Monroe Doctrine. And if you think this is just about Venezuela, you're missing the bigger picture. This is about the slow-motion collapse of American hegemony, the rise of a multipolar world, and the dangerous miscalculations that could drag us into a conflict we're not prepared to win. I've spent the last 3 decades studying great power competition, and I can tell you what's unfolding in Venezuela isn't an isolated incident. It's a microcosm of a much larger struggle, one where the rules of the game have changed, but Washington is still playing by the old ones. And if we don't wake up to that reality soon, we're going to find ourselves in a crisis we can't control. The official what they want you to believe. Here's the story the US government and most of the mainstream media have been: Venezuela is a failed state, a narco-dictatorship propped up by Russia and China, but ultimately a manageable problem. The Maduro regime is weak, isolated, and on the brink of collapse. The U.S. has imposed crippling sanctions, recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president, and maintained a policy of maximum pressure to force Maduro out. Russia and China's involvement is just opportunistic meddling, annoying, but not a serious threat to U.S. interests. The recent Russian military deployment? A desperate last gasp by a dying regime. Nothing to worry about. The data seems to support this. Venezuela's economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation has made the bolivar worthless. Millions have fled the country. The U.S. has frozen billions in Venezuelan assets, sanctioned key regime figures, and even indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges. The Lima Group, the OAS, and the EU have all recognized Guaidó. Even the UN has condemned Maduro's human rights abuses. By all accounts, the regime should have fallen years ago. And yet, it hasn't. But here's the problem with this: it assumes that economic collapse automatically translates into political collapse. It assumes that sanctions alone can force regime change. It assumes that Russia and China's involvement is peripheral, not strategic. And most dangerously, it assumes that the US still holds an unassailable military advantage in its own hemisphere. None of those assumptions hold up under scrutiny. Deconstructing what's really happening in Venezuela. Let's start with the most glaring: if Venezuela is such a basket case, why hasn't Maduro fallen? The answer is simple: because the regime has external patrons who are willing to prop it up, not out of ideological solidarity, but because it serves their geopolitical interests. Russia and China didn't invest billions in Venezuela out of the goodness of their hearts. They did it because Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. And in a world where energy security is national security, controlling that oil is a strategic imperative. Moscow and Beijing aren't just backing Maduro, they're embedding themselves in Venezuela's military, intelligence, and economic infrastructure in ways that will make it nearly impossible for the US to dislodge them without a direct confrontation. Take the Russian military deployment in March. Officially, it was just a few dozen technicians helping maintain Venezuela's S-300 air defense systems. But let's be real, those systems are already obsolete. What Russia was really doing was sending a "we're here to stay." And they're not alone. China has poured over $60 billion into Venezuela since 2007, much of it in loans secured by oil. Beijing now controls key ports, refineries, and even Venezuela's satellite communications. The Chinese have also supplied the Maduro regime with drones, radar systems, and cyber warfare capabilities, tools that could be used to disrupt U.S. operations in the region. Then there's the sanctions regime. The US likes to pretend that its economic warfare is a precision tool, but in reality, it's a blunt instrument that has only strengthened Maduro's grip. How? By forcing Venezuela into the arms of Russia and China. When the US cut off Venezuela's access to the global financial system, Moscow and Beijing stepped in with alternative payment mechanisms, barter deals, and even cryptocurrency workarounds. The result? Maduro's regime is more resilient than ever, not less. And let's talk about the military balance. The US still has a massive advantage in raw firepower, but that advantage is eroding in ways that should alarm anyone paying attention. Russia has been quietly upgrading Venezuela's military for years. They've sold them Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and even Bastion coastal defense systems capable of sinking US ships. China has supplied them with advanced surveillance drones and electronic warfare systems. And both countries have embedded military advisors in key positions, making any US intervention far riskier than it was even a decade ago. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the slow but steady militarization of Latin America by America's adversaries. And the US is letting it happen. The broader geopolitical why this matters more than you think. To understand why Venezuela is such a big deal, you have to out. We're not just talking about one failed state in South America. We're talking about the end of the unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War when the US was the sole superpower, with no serious rivals. That era is over. What we're seeing now is the rise of a multipolar world, where power is diffused among multiple centers: Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and soon, perhaps, New Delhi and others. Russia and China aren't just meddling in Venezuela for fun. They're playing a long game, one that's designed to erode US influence and create a new global order where American power is checked. And they're doing it in ways that are hard to counter because they're not directly challenging the US militarily. Instead, they're using economic leverage, proxy forces, and gray zone tactics, activities that fall below the threshold of war but still advance their strategic interests. This is classic great power competition, and the US is losing because it's still operating under the delusion that it can dictate outcomes unilaterally. The Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old policy that declared Latin America off-limits to foreign powers, is dead. Russia and China know it. The only ones who don't seem to realize it are in Washington. Let me give you a historical parallel. In 1962, the Soviet Union tried to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The US responded with a naval blockade and threatened nuclear war. The crisis was resolved only when the Soviets backed down. That was the last time a great power seriously challenged the US in its own hemisphere. Today, Russia and China are doing the same thing, but they're doing it smarter. They're not putting nukes in Venezuela. They're putting in military advisors, economic leverage, and political support. And they're doing it in a way that makes it nearly impossible for the US to respond without looking like the aggressor. This is the new normal. And the US is woefully unprepared for it. Military and strategic: the illusion of American dominance. Let's talk about the military reality on the ground. The US still has the most powerful military in the world, but that power is increasingly irrelevant in places like Venezuela. Why? Because modern warfare isn't just about tanks and fighter jets anymore. It's about cyber capabilities, electronic warfare, and the ability to project power without triggering a full-scale war. Russia and China understand this. That's why they've been so effective in Venezuela. They're not trying to match the US in conventional military strength. They're exploiting its weaknesses, its overstretched forces, its political divisions, and its reluctance to engage in another endless war. Consider if the US wanted to overthrow Maduro tomorrow, it could. A few airstrikes, a special forces raid, and the regime would collapse. But then what? The US would inherit a failed state with no functioning government, a collapsed economy, and a population that would likely resist American occupation. Sound familiar? It should. That's exactly what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's assuming the US could even get to Maduro in the first place. Venezuela's air defenses, while outdated, are still formidable. Russia has been training Venezuelan pilots on the Su-30, a fighter jet that can challenge US air superiority. China has supplied them with advanced radar systems that could detect and track U.S. aircraft. And both countries have embedded military advisors who would almost certainly be targeted in any U.S. strike, raising the risk of direct confrontation with Moscow and Beijing. This is the nightmare scenario for U.S. military, a conflict where the U.S. has to fight not just Venezuela, but Russia and China as well. And it's not just Venezuela. The same dynamic is playing out in Cuba, Nicaragua, and even Bolivia. The U.S. is losing its military edge in its own backyard, and it's doing so without a single shot being fired. The domestic political why Washington can't get its act together. So why hasn't the U.S. done more to counter Russia and China in Venezuela? The answer, in part, is domestic politics. For the past 2 decades, U.S. foreign policy has been hijacked by a toxic mix of ideological rigidity and short-term political calculations. On the right, you have the hawks who see every foreign policy challenge as a test of American resolve. They want regime change in Venezuela, not because it's strategically wise, but because it fits their narrative of U.S. strength. On the left, you have the progressives who oppose any military intervention on principle, even when it's in America's interest. And in the middle, you have a political establishment that's too divided and distracted to formulate a coherent strategy. Take the Trump administration. Trump talked tough on Venezuela, but his policy was a mess. He imposed sanctions, recognized Guaido, and even hinted at military action. But he also undermined his own efforts by alienating key allies, threatening to cut off aid to countries that didn't support his Venezuela policy, and failing to coordinate with Congress. The result? A policy that was all sticks and no carrots, one that only strengthened Maduro's position. The Biden administration hasn't done much better. They've maintained Trump's sanctions, but they've also signaled a willingness to negotiate with Maduro, something the hawks in Congress oppose. Meanwhile, Russia and China have been quietly consolidating their position in Venezuela, knowing that the U.S. is too divided to respond effectively. This is the real danger of domestic politics in foreign. It turns every decision into a partisan football, making it nearly impossible to pursue a long-term strategy. And in the meantime, America's adversaries are eating our lunch. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the 3 most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case, a managed decline. In this scenario, the U.S. accepts that it can't force Maduro out and instead focuses on containing the damage. It eases sanctions in exchange for limited political reforms, allows some humanitarian aid, and works with allies to prevent Russia and China from gaining a permanent foothold. Venezuela remains a failed state, but it doesn't become a full-blown proxy war. The U.S. avoids a military confrontation, but it also cedes influence in Latin America to its rivals. This is the least bad option, but it's still a loss for the U.S. It means accepting that the Monroe Doctrine is dead and that America's unipolar moment is over. Scenario 2, the most likely, a frozen conflict. In this scenario, Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis, a low-intensity conflict where the U.S. and its allies impose sanctions, Russia and China prop up Maduro, and the country remains a battleground for great power competition. The U.S. may occasionally escalate, perhaps with cyber attacks or covert operations, but it stops short of direct military action. Meanwhile, Russia and China continue to deepen their military and economic ties with Venezuela, making any future U.S. intervention even riskier. This is the most likely outcome because it's the path of least resistance. Neither side wants a full-scale war, but neither is willing to back down. The result is a slow-burning crisis that drains U.S. resources and emboldens its adversaries. Scenario 3, the worst case, a regional war. In this scenario, the U.S. decides it can't tolerate a Russian-Chinese proxy in its backyard and launches a military intervention. It starts with airstrikes, then escalates to a ground invasion. Russia and China respond by increasing their military support for Maduro, perhaps even deploying their own forces. The conflict spreads to Cuba, Nicaragua, and beyond. Before long, the U.S. finds itself in a regional war with no clear exit strategy. This is the nightmare scenario, but it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. The U.S. has a long history of military interventions in Latin America, and the hawks in Washington are always looking for a fight. The problem is that this time, the stakes are higher. Russia and China are not the Soviet Union. They're not going to back down. And if the US miscalculates, it could find itself in a war it can't win. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's step back for a moment and ask the bigger why is the US losing its edge in Venezuela? The answer has less to do with Venezuela itself and more to do with the fundamental flaws in America's grand strategy. For the past 3 decades, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its unmatched power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. The problem is that this strategy has failed. It's failed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. And now, it's failing in Venezuela. The reason is the world has changed, but America's strategy hasn't. The US is still trying to be the world's policeman, but it no longer has the resources or the political will to sustain that role. Meanwhile, Russia and China have adapted. They're not trying to match the US in conventional military power. They're exploiting its weaknesses, its overstretched forces, its political divisions, and its economic vulnerabilities. This is the central paradox of American power. The US is still the strongest country in the world, but it's also the most overextended. It's trying to maintain a global empire at a time when its domestic foundations are crumbling. And the result is a slow-motion decline that's playing out in places like Venezuela. If you want a historical parallel, look at the British Empire. At its height, Britain ruled a quarter of the world's population. But by the early 20th century, it was overstretched, its economy was stagnating, and its political will was fading. The result was a rapid decline that left it vulnerable to rising powers like Germany and the US. The US is not Britain. But the warning signs are there. And if we don't change course, we're going to find ourselves in the same position, dominant on paper, but increasingly irrelevant in practice. Alternatives and what the US should do instead. So what should the US do about Venezuela? The answer is not more sanctions, not more regime change fantasies, and certainly not military intervention. What the US needs is a realistic, long-term strategy that recognizes the limits of American power and the realities of great power competition. Here's what that would look. 1. Accept the new reality. The first step is to accept that the Monroe Doctrine is dead. The US can no longer dictate outcomes in Latin America. Russia and China are here to stay, and the sooner Washington accepts that, the better. That doesn't mean giving up on Venezuela. It means recognizing that the US can't unilaterally impose its will. 2. Shift from coercion to diplomacy. Sanctions haven't worked. They've only strengthened Maduro and pushed Venezuela closer to Russia and China. The US should ease sanctions in exchange for concrete political reforms, free elections, the release of political prisoners, and the restoration of democratic institutions. This won't happen overnight, but it's the only way to break the current stalemate. 3. Work with allies, not against them. The US has alienated key allies in Latin America with its heavy-handed approach. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina have their own interests, and they're not going to blindly follow Washington's lead. The US needs to rebuild those relationships, not by demanding obedience, but by offering real partnerships. 4. Counter Russia and China indirectly. The US can't kick Russia and China out of Venezuela, but it can limit their influence. That means investing in Latin America's economies, supporting democratic institutions, and offering alternatives to Chinese and Russian loans. It also means strengthening US cyber and electronic warfare capabilities to counter Russian and Chinese meddling. 5. Prepare for the worst. The US needs to be ready for the possibility of a military confrontation, even if it doesn't want one. That means modernizing its forces, improving its intelligence capabilities, and developing a clear escalation strategy. The goal isn't to start a war, but to deter one. This is a controversial approach. The hawks will call it appeasement. The progressives will call it imperialism. But it's the only realistic option. The US can't force its way in Venezuela. It has to outmaneuver its adversaries, not outmiss. Here's the uncomfortable: the US military's eroding edge in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's a microcosm of a much larger problem, one that Washington has been slow to acknowledge, let alone address. The Pentagon's 2023 National Defense Strategy quietly admitted that the U.S. is no longer the undisputed military hegemon in every theater, but the implications of that admission haven't sunk in where it matters in the halls of Congress, the think tanks of D.C., or the war rooms of U.S. Southern Command. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. First, Venezuela is a test case for how Russia and China are rewriting the rules of great power competition in America's backyard. Moscow and Beijing aren't just propping up Maduro, they're building a template for how to challenge U.S. dominance without triggering a direct military response. Russia's deployment of nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018 wasn't just a provocation, it was a proof of concept. The two 160s that landed at Maiquetía International Airport weren't there to fight. They were there to signal that Russia could project power into the Western Hemisphere at will, and the U.S. couldn't stop it. The fact that those bombers returned in 2020, this time with a stop in Nicaragua, should have set off alarm bells. Instead, it was treated as a footnote. Now, what most people don't realize is that Russia's military footprint in Venezuela is far more sophisticated than a few bombers and Wagner Group contractors. Since 2019, Moscow has been quietly extending its electronic warfare capabilities in the country, deploying Krasukha-4 systems designed to jam U.S. surveillance drones and early warning radars. These aren't just defensive tools, they're force multipliers that could blind U.S. intelligence assets in a crisis. Meanwhile, China has been embedding itself in Venezuela's military infrastructure in ways that are harder to detect but just as dangerous. The Venezuelan military's communications network, for instance, now runs on Chinese-made Huawei and ZTE equipment, which U.S. intelligence has long suspected of having backdoors for Beijing. When Maduro's government announced in 2022 that it was adopting China's Beidou satellite navigation system, replacing GPS for military operations, it wasn't just a technical upgrade. It was a strategic shift, one that could allow Venezuela to operate independently of U.S. satellite networks in a conflict. Here's why the U.S. military has spent the last 3 decades fighting insurgencies in the Middle East and Central Asia, where air superiority was never in question and adversaries lacked the ability to contest U.S. dominance in the electromagnetic spectrum. Venezuela is different. It's the first place where the U.S. is facing a peer competitor's military footprint in its own hemisphere, and the Pentagon isn't ready. The last time the U.S. had to think seriously about great power competition in Latin America was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Back then, the Soviet Union was a distant threat, and the U.S. could enforce a naval blockade without worrying about cyber attacks or hypersonic missiles. Today, Russia and China are inside the perimeter, and they're playing a different game. Let's talk about the military implications. The U.S. has 2 primary options for projecting power into air and sea. Both are increasingly at risk. On the air side, Venezuela's air defenses, bolstered by Russian S-300 systems, are now among the most capable in Latin America. The S-300 isn't as advanced as the S-400s Russia has deployed in Syria, but it's more than enough to complicate any U.S. air campaign. During the 2019 crisis, when the Trump administration was openly discussing military options, U.S. Air Force planners had to game out scenarios where F-22s and F-35s would have to suppress or evade these systems. The results weren't encouraging. The U.S. could still achieve air superiority, but it would come at a cost, one that might not be politically sustainable in a region where the U.S. is already seen as a bully. Then there's the sea. The U.S. Navy still dominates the Caribbean, but Russia and China have been chipping away at that dominance in ways that don't make headlines but matter deeply. Russia's use of ghost ships, commercial vessels repurposed for military logistics, has allowed it to resupply Venezuela without triggering U.S. interdiction. In 2020, the U.S. seized a Russian-flagged tanker carrying fuel to Venezuela, but that was the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, these ships slip through the cracks. Meanwhile, China has been extending its port access in the region, with deep water facilities in AMA, Jamaica, and the Bahamas that could one day support Chinese naval operations. The U.S. still has the upper hand at sea, but the margin is shrinking. Now, the most dangerous blind spot in Washington's thinking is the assumption that Russia and China won't escalate militarily. That's a dangerous gamble. In 2019, when the U.S. recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, Russia responded by sending a pair of nuclear-capable bombers to Caracas. When the U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, China ramped up its purchases of Venezuelan crude, effectively backfilling the lost revenue. These aren't isolated incidents, they're part of a pattern. Moscow and Beijing have shown that they're willing to match U.S. pressure with their own, and they're doing it in a way that stays just below the threshold of direct conflict. The question isn't whether they'll escalate further, it's when and how. Here's the U.S. isn't just losing ground in Venezuela. It's losing the narrative. For decades, the U.S. has framed its military presence in Latin America as a stabilizing force, a bulwark against chaos and authoritarianism. But in Venezuela, the U.S. is increasingly seen as the destabilizing actor. When the Trump administration imposed sanctions that crippled Venezuela's economy, it wasn't just Maduro who suffered. Ordinary Venezuelans did too, and they blamed the U.S. When the U.S.-backed Guaido's failed uprising in 2019, it wasn't just a political miscalculation, it was a propaganda gift to Maduro, who could paint the opposition as a U.S. puppet. Russia and China have been all too happy to amplify that message, using state media and social media campaigns to portray the U.S. as an imperialist power meddling in Venezuela's affairs. So where does this leave us? The U.S. still has options, but they're not the ones that Washington is used to. The era of unilateral military interventions in Latin America is over. The era of economic coercion is fading. What's left is a much harder competing in the gray zone, where the rules are unclear and the stakes are high. That means investing in cyber capabilities to counter Russian and Chinese influence operations. It means rebuilding relationships with Latin American militaries that have been neglected for decades. It means offering real economic alternatives to Chinese loans, not just empty promises. And it means accepting that the U.S. can't dictate outcomes in Venezuela or anywhere else in the region without paying a price. The uncomfortable truth is that the U.S. is no longer the only game in town. Russia and China have made that clear. The question is whether Washington is willing to adapt or whether it will keep pretending that the old rules still apply. Because if there's one thing we've learned from Venezuela, it's that the old rules don't work anymore. Now, what most people don't realize is that this shift in Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic political time bomb for the United States. The erosion of America's military edge in the region isn't happening in a vacuum. It's colliding with a moment of deep polarization at home, where every foreign policy decision is immediately weaponized for partisan gain. And that's where things get really dangerous. Let me explain why this matters. For the past decade, U.S. policy toward Venezuela has been less about Venezuela itself and more about scoring points in Washington's culture wars. The Trump administration's approach, maximum pressure, sanctions, and the recognition of Juan Guaido as interim president wasn't just a strategic miscalculation. It was a performative act, designed to signal toughness to a domestic audience. The problem? That audience was never the Venezuelan people. It was Republican voters in Florida, where the Venezuelan exile community has become a powerful electoral bloc. When Trump imposed sanctions in 2017 and 2019, he wasn't just targeting Maduro's regime. He was sending a message to Miami-Dade, we're the ones who take the fight to the dictators. But here's the uncomfortable: that strategy backfired in ways that are only now becoming clear. The sanctions didn't topple Maduro. They didn't even weaken him in any meaningful way. What they did do was accelerate Venezuela's economic collapse, pushing millions of refugees into Colombia, Brazil, and the United States. And that refugee crisis? It's now fueling the very nativist backlash that Trump and his allies have been stoking for years. You can draw a straight line from the 2019 sanctions to the 2021 border surge, and from there to the 2024 election, where immigration is once again the defining issue. The irony is the same policy that was supposed to rally the base has ended up feeding the very crisis that's now threatening to sink Biden's re-election. And it's not just the Republicans who are trapped in this cycle. The Democrats, for their part, have spent the last 4 years trying to thread an impossible needle. They've kept the sanctions in place because walking them back would be political suicide, but they've also tried to distance themselves from Trump's more aggressive rhetoric. The result? A policy that satisfies no one. The Venezuelan opposition feels abandoned. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which has been pushing for a more humane approach, feels ignored. And the average American voter? They're left with the impression that Washington is just spinning its wheels, throwing money and sanctions at a problem that only seems to get worse. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election, because that's where this all comes to a head. If Trump wins in November, we can expect a return to the same: more sanctions, more bluster, and a renewed push to recognize Guaido or some other opposition figure as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. But here's that playbook is even more outdated than it was in 2019. Maduro has consolidated power. Russia and China have dug in deeper. And the Venezuelan military, which was once seen as a potential weak point, has been thoroughly co-opted by the regime. A Trump administration would find itself in the same position as the last, with no good options, and a domestic audience that expects miracles. If Biden wins, the challenges are just as daunting, but in a different way. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party is already pushing for a reset: less sanctions, more engagement, and a recognition that the current approach isn't working. But any move in that direction will be met with howls of betrayal from the right, and from the Venezuelan exile community in Florida. Remember, Florida is a swing state, and the Venezuelan vote is now a critical part of its political calculus. Biden can't afford to lose it, which means he's stuck between a rock and a hard: either double down on a failed policy, or risk a political firestorm by trying something new. Here's where the scenario projections get really grim. The most likely outcome, in my view, is a continuation of the status quo: half measures, mixed signals, and a slow-motion erosion of U.S. influence. But that's not the worst-case scenario. The worst-case scenario is that Venezuela becomes a proxy battleground in a larger U.S.-China or U.S.-Russia conflict. Imagine a scenario where Maduro, facing renewed U.S. pressure, invites Russian troops or Chinese military advisors into the country under the guise of training exercises. Or imagine a cyber attack on U.S. infrastructure, traced back to Venezuela but with Russian fingerprints all over it. How does Washington respond? Does it risk a direct confrontation with Moscow or Beijing? Or does it back down, further emboldening its adversaries? The other nightmare scenario is that Venezuela's collapse accelerates, triggering a regional crisis that the U.S. is ill-prepared to handle. We're already seeing the early signs of this. Colombia, which has absorbed nearly 3 million Venezuelan refugees, is struggling with the economic and social strain. Brazil, under Lula, has taken a more conciliatory approach to Maduro, but that could change if the refugee flows increase. And then there's the United States itself, where the political backlash against immigration is already reaching a fever pitch. If another million Venezuelans flee north in the next 2 years, the domestic consequences could be catastrophic, not just for Biden, but for the stability of the U.S. political system. So where does that leave us? The truth is, the U.S. is running out of time to adapt. The old playbook: sanctions, saber-rattling, and regime change fantasies isn't just ineffective. It's actively making the problem worse. But the alternative, a more nuanced, diplomatic approach, is politically toxic in today's hyperpolarized environment. The question isn't whether the U.S. can afford to change course. The question is whether it can afford not to. Because if there's one thing we've learned from the past 2 decades of U.S. foreign policy, it's that the costs of inaction are often higher than the costs of action. And in Venezuela, those costs are about to come due. Now, what most people don't realize is that the United States isn't just losing influence in Venezuela, it's losing the ability to shape outcomes in its own backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, for all its flaws, was once the bedrock of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Today, it's little more than a historical footnote, a relic of an era when Washington could dictate terms to Latin American governments without pushback. The problem isn't just that China and Russia are filling the void, it's that the U.S. has spent decades treating the region as an afterthought, a place where the only policy tools were either neglect or coercion. And now, when it finally needs to engage seriously, it finds itself outmaneuvered by adversaries who understand something in the 21st century. Power isn't just about military might, it's about economic leverage, diplomatic persistence, and the willingness to play the long game. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. What's happening in Caracas isn't an isolated case, it's a microcosm of a broader shift in global power dynamics. The U.S. still spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, but that spending hasn't translated into the kind of influence it once did. Part of the reason is that America's adversaries have gotten smarter. They don't need to match the US tank for tank or fighter jet for fighter jet. Instead, they're exploiting the gaps in American strategy, the places where hard power doesn't translate into soft power, where military dominance doesn't guarantee economic or political control. Venezuela is a perfect example. The US has sanctions, a naval blockade, and a history of covert operations, but none of that has dislodged Maduro. Meanwhile, China has quietly become Venezuela's largest creditor, Russia has supplied arms and political cover, and Iran has stepped in with oil-for-goods deals that keep the regime afloat. The result? A country that should, by all rights, be a US client state is instead a hub for anti-American activity, and Washington is left scrambling to respond. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent grand strategy for Latin America. What passes for policy is a patchwork of half-measures, sanctions here, a diplomatic snub there, the occasional military exercise to remind everyone who's boss. But none of it adds up to a sustainable approach. The last time the US had a real strategy for the region was during the Cold War, when it treated every leftist movement as a Soviet proxy and every election as a zero-sum game. That approach worked, in a brutal sort of way, but it also left a legacy of resentment that still shapes Latin American politics today. Fast forward to 2024, and the US is still operating on autopilot, defaulting to the same tired playbook even as the world changes around it. So what are the alternatives? The first, and most obvious, is to double down on the status quo. Keep the sanctions, keep the pressure, and hope that Maduro eventually cracks. But as we've seen, that's not working. The sanctions have hurt the Venezuelan people far more than they've hurt the regime, and they've given China and Russia an opening to present themselves as the more reliable partners. The second option is to try a more diplomatic approach, lift some sanctions in exchange for concessions, reopen channels of communication, and accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But that's politically toxic in Washington, where any hint of engagement with Caracas is seen as a betrayal of the Venezuelan opposition. The third option is the most: a full-scale rethink of US policy toward Latin America, one that prioritizes economic engagement over military posturing and treats the region as a partner rather than a client. But that would require a level of political courage that neither party has shown in decades. Let's be, none of these options are perfect. The first is a recipe for continued failure. The second risks alienating key allies in the Venezuelan opposition and the US Congress. The third would require a fundamental shift in how Washington views the world, and that's not something that happens overnight. But the alternative, doing nothing, is worse. Because if the US doesn't adapt, it's not just Venezuela that will slip away. It's the entire region. I've spent enough time in the halls of power to know how these debates play out. The realists will argue for a pragmatic approach, one that accepts the world as it is rather than how we wish it to be. The idealists will push for a values-based foreign policy, one that refuses to engage with dictators and human rights abusers. And the hawks will demand more pressure, more sanctions, more military posturing. But here's what none of them seem to in Venezuela: all of those approaches have already been tried, and all of them have failed. The question isn't which one is the most ideologically pure. The question is which one actually works. The answer, I suspect, lies somewhere in between. The US needs to recognize that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not in the short term, and that continuing to treat him as a pariah only plays into his hands. At the same time, it can't afford to abandon the Venezuelan opposition entirely, because that would send a message to other authoritarian regimes that the US is willing to cut deals with anyone, no matter how brutal. The solution, if there is one, is a calibrated approach: targeted sanctions that hurt the regime but not the people, diplomatic engagement that keeps the door open for future negotiations, and a regional strategy that addresses the root causes of Venezuela's collapse rather than just its symptoms. But let's not kid ourselves. Even if the US adopts this approach, it won't be easy. The political climate in Washington is more polarized than ever, and any move toward engagement with Venezuela will be met with howls of protest from both sides of the aisle. The media will frame it as a capitulation, the opposition will accuse the administration of betrayal, and the hawks will demand more pressure. And that's before we even get to the reaction from Caracas, where Maduro will almost certainly pocket any concessions without giving anything in return. So why bother? Because the alternative is worse. Because if the US doesn't change course, it will wake up one day to find that it has lost not just Venezuela, but the entire region. Because the costs of inaction are already piling up, refugees flooding into Colombia and the US, Chinese and Russian influence spreading unchecked, and a generation of Latin Americans who see the United States not as a partner, but as an obstacle to their prosperity. And because, in the end, the only thing more dangerous than trying something new is clinging to a strategy that has already failed. I've been doing this long enough to know that grand strategies don't always work out the way you plan. But I also know that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results isn't strategy, it's insanity. The US has a choice to make. It can keep pretending that the old playbook still works, or it can adapt to a world where power is no longer measured in aircraft carriers and cruise missiles. The clock is ticking. And in Venezuela, time is running out.